It started with a whisper among the locals, a rumor, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones at the town's only bar. The midnight train, they called it. No one had seen it for years, maybe decades. The tracks had long been forgotten, overgrown with weeds, and even the old station was left to rot at the edge of town. But lately, things had changed. It was early fall when I first heard the stories. Nights were growing longer, and a chill in the air seemed to carry the weight of something heavy, something waiting. That night I was walking home, the road lit only by the flickering streetlights. The town was quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it, low and distant, like thunder rumbling far away. A long, mournful whistle. I stopped in my tracks. The sound came again, clearer this time, a train horn that seemed to rise out of the past. But that couldn't be right. No trains had run through this town in years. The old tracks were supposed to be abandoned, rusted relics swallowed by the forest. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks, the sound of some truck on the highway. But that night I couldn't sleep. The next morning the talk was everywhere. People claimed they'd heard the same thing, the unmistakable wail of a train's horn, cutting through the dead of night. The old-timers, the ones who had been around since the town had a pulse, shook their heads knowingly, like they were bracing for something. "Must be the midnight train," one of them said. His voice was gravelly, weighed down by years of smoke and cheap whiskey. "Heard it once when I was a kid. My dad said it only comes back when it's got unfinished business." He trailed off, his eyes glazing over as if remembering something too dark to share. That evening, curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut, the nagging sense that something was happening, something I needed to see. So, I grabbed a flashlight, bundled up, and decided to follow the tracks into the woods. It took a while to find the old railroad. Most of it was buried under decades of neglect, the metal rails twisted and sunken, barely visible under layers of dirt and overgrowth. But eventually I found a clear stretch that led straight into the woods. The silence was unnerving, not even a whisper of wind. The trees around me stood still like sentinels. I followed the rails deeper into the forest, the world growing darker with every step. I reached the abandoned station just as the last bit of daylight faded away. It stood there like a corpse, crumbling, broken, and forgotten. The old ticket booth was barely more than splinters, windows shattered and vines creeping up the stone walls like skeletal fingers. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine as I scanned the area, looking for any sign of life, any sign of a train. But there was nothing. Just the eerie, oppressive silence. And then, out of the quiet, it came. The ground beneath my feet trembled ever so slightly, a soft vibration that quickly grew into something more. My heart started pounding as I turned my head, eyes scanning the darkened horizon. The air thickened, filled with a low hum, an electric charge that made the hair on my arms stand up. The train horn blasted through the silence like a scream. It was closer now, too close. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering, barely catching a glimpse of the rails ahead. The metal shimmered, shaking violently as if something enormous was hurtling down the tracks. But there was no train, not yet. Just the sound, the rattling thunder of wheels that hadn't touched these tracks in decades. A gust of wind blasted through the station, swirling leaves and debris into the air. The temperature plummeted, my breath coming out in visible puffs as I backed away from the tracks, my mind racing. The ground shook harder now, the vibrations pounding through my feet, up into my chest, and then I saw it. Out of the darkness, the headlight appeared, blinding and white, cutting through the fog like a knife. The train was massive, an old steam locomotive, its black steel body gleaming as it barreled toward the station. But something was wrong. The train wasn't right. It didn't seem to fully exist. It was like looking at a reflection on a broken mirror, flickering, phasing in and out of view. 1 second it was there, solid and terrifying, and the next it was nothing but a shadow, a whisper of smoke and fog. But the sound was real. The deafening roar of the engine, the screech of metal grinding against metal, and the horn, it blared again, almost as if it was calling for something. I stumbled back further, my body locked in a mix of terror and disbelief. This wasn't just a ghost train. It felt alive. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, as if the very air was being swallowed up by the thing. The windows were dark, but I could swear I saw faces. Pale, gaunt faces staring out into the night, their eyes hollow and endless. As it roared past me, the train screeched to a stop right in front of the old platform, its wheels sparking as if they were tearing through reality itself. The door slid open with a bone-chilling creak. For a moment there was nothing, just the gaping darkness of the doorway beckoning. And then I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, stepped out onto the platform. Tall, impossibly thin, cloaked in black. Its face was hidden, but I felt its eyes, burning into me from across the station. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. My breath caught in my throat as the wind picked up, howling now, twisting around me like it was alive. The figure stepped forward, just a single step, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming dread wash over me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The train's horn blasted one last time, a long, mournful wail that seemed to echo through the trees. And then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the figure stepped back into the train, the door sliding shut with a sound that made my blood freeze. The train jerked forward, slowly at first, the wheels grinding as it pulled away from the station. I watched, paralyzed, as it disappeared into the fog, the last flicker of its headlight fading into the night. The silence returned, thicker now, almost smothering. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart still racing, my body shaking. I couldn't explain it, couldn't process what I had just seen. But one thing was clear. The midnight train was real. And it wasn't done. The next night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the train had been calling to me. It's hard to explain, but the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me like a splinter buried deep in my mind. I kept replaying the moment it appeared out of the dark, its wheels screeching and that ghostly figure stepping out onto the platform. I could still feel its presence, that oppressive weight as it had watched me, motionless like it had been waiting for me. Even now, sitting in my kitchen with a cold beer in hand, I couldn't get it out of my head. I found myself staring out the window, eyes drifting toward the direction of the tracks. They were only a few miles into the woods, but it felt like they were right on the edge of my consciousness, tugging at me with invisible strings. I knew I shouldn't go back. Common sense told me to forget about it, to leave well enough alone. But the rest of me, the curious, reckless part, was already planning my next move. By midnight, I had grabbed my backpack, thrown on my jacket, and stuffed my headphones in my pocket. There was something inside me pulling me back to those tracks, something I couldn't ignore. The walk through the woods felt different this time. Colder. Darker. The trees loomed like silent giants, their branches twisting together like tangled arms overhead, blocking out the stars. Every step felt heavier, like the earth itself was pushing back against me, trying to keep me away. But I kept going. I found the tracks with little effort, the rusted rails glinting faintly under the moonlight. As soon as my boots hit the metal, I felt that familiar hum beneath my feet, a low vibration I hadn't noticed before. It was faint, but it was there, a pulse like the heartbeat of something ancient and hidden beneath the earth. I slid my headphones on, trying to drown out the eerie stillness around me with music. Something to keep my mind off the creeping dread that was curling in my stomach. The sound filled my ears, a familiar song, but it didn't help. The weight of the woods pressed in on me as I walked further down the tracks, following the twisted path as it wound deeper and deeper into the wilderness. The night felt endless. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see something, anything, lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the quiet stretch of railroad stretching out into oblivion. My heartbeat matched the rhythm of my footsteps, steady, but quickening with every step I took. It wasn't long before the tracks began to change. The further I walked, the more warped they became. The rails twisted unnaturally, bending at odd angles as if something heavy had crushed them. Weeds grew thick between the ties, and in some places, the earth had swallowed entire sections of the tracks. Yet, despite the disrepair, I could still feel that low, steady hum beneath my feet. The music in my headphones started to distort. Static crackled in the background, interrupting the melody. I fiddled with the cord, thinking it might have been a loose connection, but the static only grew louder, more invasive. Then, without warning, the music cut out completely. Silence. Just the sound of my own breathing, the shuffle of my boots on gravel. I yanked the headphones off and shoved them into my pocket, suddenly feeling very exposed. That's when I saw it. Up ahead, the tracks sloped downward at a sharp angle, disappearing into the ground. No, not the ground, a pit. A massive, gaping hole in the earth as wide as a canyon. I squinted in the darkness, trying to make sense of it. How had I never noticed this before? The tracks led directly into the abyss, vanishing into the black void as if swallowed by the earth itself. The air around me grew still, unnaturally so. The hum beneath the tracks intensified, vibrating through the soles of my feet, making my legs feel weak. A cold sweat prickled the back of my neck as I stepped closer to the edge of the pit, peering down into the darkness below. It was endless. A void, deep and impossibly dark. The bottom wasn't visible, just a yawning chasm that seemed to go on forever. Suddenly the air shifted. A breeze swept through the trees, colder than before, and with it came the faintest sound. A low whistle, distant but unmistakable. The train. My heart leaped into my throat. I turned, frantically searching the horizon for any sign of the locomotive, but there was nothing. Just the eerie silence and the empty tracks. But the whistle grew louder, closer, until the very air seemed to tremble with its approach. I barely had time to react when the light hit me. Blinding. Yellow. It cut through the darkness like a dagger, flooding the pit with its harsh glow. The ground shook beneath me, the vibration almost knocking me off my feet. I staggered backward, shielding my eyes from the light as the train emerged from the void. It wasn't coming from the tracks. It was rising from the pit. I stumbled, nearly falling as the monstrous engine climbed out of the chasm, its wheels sparking against the twisted rails. The same black, hulking train from the night before, its headlight blazing as it ascended from the depths. The air around me pulsed with the deafening roar of the engine, the sound of steel grinding against steel. I tried to move, to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Paralyzed by the sight of the train as it loomed above me, its massive body casting a long shadow across the ground. And then I saw him. The figure. Tall, thin, cloaked in black. He stood on the edge of the train's front car, just as before, his hollow eyes locked onto me. His presence was suffocating, a force that pressed down on me like the weight of 1,000 hands. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey. The figure stepped down from the train, his movements slow, deliberate. Each step he took toward me sent a jolt of fear through my chest. He reached the edge of the pit, his head tilted slightly as if considering me, watching my every breath. I backed away, inching closer to the edge of the pit. The ground crumbled beneath my heels, but I didn't dare take my eyes off him. He moved like a shadow, his black cloak billowing around him as he came closer. The train's whistle screamed again, a high-pitched wail that seemed to shake the very earth. And then he was in front of me. I tried to scream, but before the sound could leave my throat, his hand shot out, gripping my chest with an unnatural strength. The touch was icy, colder than anything I had ever felt. My breath caught in my lungs, panic flooding my body as he leaned in closer, his face still hidden beneath the hood. He whispered something, words that I couldn't understand, and then with a violent shove he pushed me. I fell. The world tilted, my vision spinning as I plummeted into the pit. The wind roared in my ears, my body tumbling through the cold, empty air. Above me the train's headlight grew smaller, a distant speck in the vast, dark sky. My stomach lurched, the sensation of falling endless, as if the pit had no bottom. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the figure, standing at the edge of the abyss, watching me with those hollow, empty eyes. And then everything went black.